The Florida Gators 2023 recruiting class is setting this offense up for immediate and future success under Billy Napier.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Locked On Gators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to the podcast. Happy Thursday. I'm Brandon Olson. Find me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33. And we're going to talk about how this Florida Gators 2023 recruiting class, however, there weren't a ton of offensive players here, but man, are they going to be impactful offensive players, which really, would you rather have a lot of offensive players where half of them aren't impactful, or would you rather have fewer offensive players where you feel like a lot of them can make an impact? And we're going to start with what I think is the most important part of this, which is the dynamic playmaker part of it. You look at the pass catchers, skill position, whatever you want to call them. But you look at who Billy Napier and this coaching staff brought in for the 2023 cycle, and it's kind of impressive, right? Like, you added a starting receiver trio in Aidan Mizell, Eugene Wilson III, and Andy Jean. And I don't just mean starting receiver trio as in, oh, you have three guys who can start at receiver. I mean, you have three guys who can fill the not specific roles, but the stereotypical roles that you have here. Sure, X, you're probably not super comfortable with X because, I mean, Aidan Mizell is your tallest receiver here at 6'2"-ish. And, not exactly the physical strong type, but in terms of a modern X that can stretch the field, that can win down the sideline, that can operate all throughout. Yes, you have that addressed in Aidan Mizell and Andy Jean. They're both kind of interchangeable on the outside. So you have both of those spots filled in, where Florida last year, of course, had Justin Shorter as your stereotypical X, and then you had Xzavier Henderson on the other side. And, I mean, look, build-wise, and I don't even want to say skill set-wise, but build-wise, Aidan Mizell can do what Xzavier Henderson did. Mostly because Xzavier Henderson was not asked to do a ton, but we'll talk about that later on today. But you have Aidan Mizell and Andy Jean that could start on the outside with Eugene Wilson III in the slot. However, I truly believe all three of these guys can play in the slot interchangeably, but Eugene Wilson III is better suited to it. So you added a starting receiver trio in the sense where all three of those guys can start at the specific spots that Billy Napier wants, and they can also start at another interchangeable spot. I think that Eugene Wilson III probably not going to be playing the X much, but he can line up at that other outside receiver spot, which I hate, by the way, that we have to talk about this as like there's an X and then there's a Y and then there's a Z and then there's all these things. And it's incredibly frustrating. Modern football is positionless football. Okay. You need guys who can do everything and get really creative with it, but that's neither here nor there right now. You have a starting receiver trio for when you do go 11 personnel. And you added a guy in Treyaun Webb who can be one of your running backs, because we know Billy Napier. Like, I can't even be like, oh, he's going to be your bell cow back, because one, I don't think he's going to be. I don't think he's ever going to be a bell cow back. But also, we know Billy Napier is not really going to have a bell cow back in the true traditional sense, because that's not modern football. That's one thing that Billy Napier has done for a while that is very modern. Is like, we don't have one bell cow running back. Like, we don't have Derrick Henry or something like that. Like, we have guys that we rotate in, and Treyaun Webb is another one of those guys. I don't know if he'll be able to do it immediately. Like, I just don't know if he's going to be asked to contribute immediately. I do think he has a role. I don't think he'll be asked to contribute immediately, but he could if he was asked. But this team last year was sorely desperately lacking players who can catch the ball underneath and turn those into true catch and run yard after the catch opportunities. You had a couple of guys who could do it, but Xzavier Henderson, he did a surprisingly good job at creating yards after the catch for a guy who's not super nimble. And I'm not talking about, the Georgia game where he just caught it down the sideline and ran straight a bunch. I mean, there were a few times where Xzavier Henderson caught a ball at or behind the line of scrimmage, made one or two men miss, and then turned it into a short gain, which I know short gains suck, right? But if it's going from a loss to a short gain, you take that 9 times out of 10, right? His team was sorely lacking those players who can catch the ball underneath and make those plays. Justin Shorter did a lot of his work on the outside and deep, and that's where he would, to start the LSU game. He had yards after the catch because he caught the ball and there was nobody in front of him and ran in. But you didn't have many players who would catch the ball, make men miss, and do that. And I think all 4 of your skill position players can do that. Aidan Mizell is probably more of the just run by him kind of guy, sure. But he can still do that. You make one man miss with a little shiftiness and you're as fast as Aidan Mizell and you zoom. Eugene Wilson III, very, very shifty. Like that man he's not Kadarius. I want to get that out of the way before people make that jump to when you go, oh, like they can make plays after the catch. Everyone wants Kadarius Toney. Eugene Wilson III isn't that, but he's pretty dang shifty. Okay. Andy Jean, I think, is more of the kind of just, I don't know. It's not like he does anything insane after the catch, but he somehow finds yards after it, which is great. And Treyaun Webb, great stiff arm with those long arms he has. Would love it if he bulked up a little bit, but great stiff arm with the long arms, can make a man miss with a juke. Not a super creative guy. That's what I should have said for Andy Jean. Not super creative, but you make a man miss here or there and you pick up some yards. So I think all 4 of the guys can do that, which is something that this team just didn't have really last year. And this year, if those 4 guys aren't included often, we might not see it much from the Florida Gators pass catchers in 2023. We are going to talk about a different kind of creativity, though, which is scheme creativity. But first, today's episode of Locked On Gators is brought to you by Birddogs, and I'm telling you, I'm wearing them right now. I'm not going to stand up because that's disgusting, but I am going to say that I'm wearing my Birddogs right now. Perfect, comfortable, and incredibly comfortable. I'm wearing these now, and then I'm going to go play basketball, and so I'm not changing shorts. I'm keeping the Birddogs because they're that versatile, which, I mean, if we're talking about creativity and versatility, you don't get more creative or versatile than Birddogs. You can wear them to do anything, swim. You can wear them to go work out, to lounge around your house, go for a nice little walk, which, I mean, if you're me last week, for some reason, it was 10 miles, which is just weird because I don't do that. But you could do that. Go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege. And when you enter promo code LockedOnCollege, they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Thanks again for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please do make sure to like, subscribe, comment, review, join the Locked On Gators Discord. The link's in the description below. But now we are talking about what this offensive recruiting class brings in terms of scheme versatility, scheme creativity, because that's something where it feels like in 2022, Billy Napier ran a similar scheme to one that he ran in Louisiana, but it wasn't necessarily a huge fit talent-wise or player-wise, we'll say. Because Louisiana, obviously he had better players in Florida than Louisiana, but in Louisiana he had players that fit his scheme that he brought in. And that's a big difference where Florida, you had better players. Louisiana, you had your players. And if you're sticking to your scheme and you're not adapting to that, then that's rough. But we'll see how it goes. But now he's adding his players. The biggest complaint I think a lot of Gators fans had last year in terms of offensive play calling was Xzavier Henderson's usage, which I spoke about earlier, where Xzavier Henderson was tall and fast, not super shifty. Again, could make a man miss here and there, but not super shifty. But he was often the motion man, whether it was orbit or jet, doesn't matter. He was often the motion man. Imagine that with Aidan Mizell, because you're going to have Xzavier Henderson do that, but Aidan Mizell is even faster. And Xzavier Henderson's fast. Like, I hate that people try to, I think, forcefully like downplay how fast he is. Xzavier Henderson was like the 9th fastest player in college football last year. Topped, I think it was 22.03 miles per hour. He's insanely fast. Aidan Mizell's faster. Like, Aidan Mizell has legitimate track speed. So imagine him being the motion man. Like, we know that they're going to do it with one of the outside receivers, and it's not going to be the X receiver. So Aidan Mizell could be the jet man, the orbit man, whatever it is. But he's even faster than Xzavier Henderson. And I do think Aidan Mizell is on par with Xzavier Henderson's shiftiness, if not a little more shifty or a little more creative after the catch, which means you have faster and either the same or more creativity. And that's likely going to lead to more explosive plays here, especially if Billy Napier is going to use that guy in that role. It's going to be Aidan Mizell, right? But if you're going to give it to the guy with world track speed or world class speed, then hey, I'm not going to complain, right? You got to get the ball in your playmaker's hands in any way you can in space. That's what Billy Napier's trying to do with that. There's two main roles here. It's diagnose what the defense is doing with a pre-snap motion, because let's say you're playing, I don't know, Georgia, for example. You're playing Georgia. You have your outside receiver come across the formation. If the corner that's lined up with him pre-snap runs with him entirely across the formation, congratulations. You're pretty positive they're playing man, right? If he doesn't and everybody just shifts over, pretty positive that they're playing zone. And so you have, like, you're going to do that either way. You are. Because, and we'll talk about the slot in just a minute, but you're going to do that with that guy because it helps you diagnose the play and it helps you get the ball in hands of your fast players in space. So I understand the logic behind it. I understand doing it. I just think that Xzavier Henderson wasn't the guy to do it with last year. Aidan Mizell maybe will be better with it, especially with his speed. And I think the acceleration's a bigger part here, that he's like quick to reach his top speed. So if you can get that out in space up wide, you can create yards after the catch or yards in general with just that speed. And you don't need to be as creative. Eugene Wilson III is someone that I also think can be used as one of those motion guys more than Ricky Pearsall was, or will be used as one of those motion guys more than Ricky Pearsall was. I don't think Eugene Wilson III is better than Ricky Pearsall. I get that. But this is another way where using him as motion could help break down what the defense does with that shift. Although I do think it's a little harder to break that down, especially when you look at how light college defenses are, where I wouldn't put it past a college defense to put their fast linebacker or their will linebacker on a slot if they're in man or zone, to be like, hey, like, look, like this guy's probably standing underneath, just shut that down. So you can use the slot guy in motion and you either have a linebacker on him, which doesn't necessarily give you what the coverage is, but he is more likely to get shook by your slot receiver. Or if the corner follows, then you're like, okay, we're probably looking here across the formation, so we can figure these things out. And I think Eugene Wilson will be one of those slot guys that can just be used as the motion man, but also will hopefully get the ball on those jet. We didn't really see slot orbit. That's not a thing you see often, but that jet motion underneath, hopefully we'll see Eugene Wilson get the ball more. I think that's another big thing that I've had an issue with Billy Napier is the amount of times you use that jet motion or that orbit motion and don't give it to the jet man or the orbit man, I think hurts you. Like, yeah, you gave it to them occasionally. I need you to make the defense fully fear what you're doing with that motion. Because it's pretty obvious Florida uses the motion mostly to help diagnose what the defense does. But if you use that motion and you actually run the jet touch pass or the pop pass or the end around or the orbit bubble, whatever you want to call it, or not even whatever you want to call it, whichever one you want to do, as long as you do that more often, you will strike fear into the defense because you are getting the ball in the hands of dynamic playmakers while they're already in a sprint. and you will get them the ball and you will get yards after catch, easy yards, especially for this year where yards are probably going to be a bit harder to come by than they were last year. Then we also talk about Treyaun Webb, who I think is an underrated receiver out of the backfield. I think he's a modern, passing down back. I instinctively want to say third down back, but I know that that's not right because it's 2023. Every down is or more of a passing down. But Treyaun Webb, better receiver out of the backfield. So if Billy Napier and this coaching staff are truly serious about using their running backs in the passing game more than they did in 2022, he's an option, honestly, immediately. And I do think that they want to use the running backs more in the passing. I think that was the big selling point for bringing Cam Carroll in from Tulane. And if you're going to get involved, if you're going to get Treyaun Webb involved in any way, you should probably make it in the passing game early on, just because I think he'd be great as a check down option there for Graham Mertz, who does like to throw to the backs. So I think Treyaun Webb is kind of being not slept on, a little overlooked as a receiver out of the backfield, and obviously as a runner, he can make things happen. Looking at the last part of this recruiting class that we haven't spoken about today, offensive line. And I do want to say that I think the biggest selling point from this 2023 class along the offensive line is mostly the depth that it brings to you. Not that I don't think there's talent here. There's obvious talent here. But I think that when you're looking at this offensive line class, what you bring in is depth. The spring game showed us that this offensive line for 2023 is relatively thin. But I do love the promise that this class has. Like, they might not be ready to go in 2023 fully, but they've got a ton of potential. And I mean a lot of potential here. Like, Roderick Kearney is who we're going to talk about first because he's obviously the highest ranked offensive lineman. He was the third highest ranked player in this, fourth highest ranked player in this entire class behind Kelby Collins, Jakeem Jackson, and Aidan Mizell. Roderick Kearney was your fourth highest player. And I think he'll be successful at any spot he plays. And by any spot he plays, I do mean the likely interior. He's not going to be playing tackle. That's not something I see him doing or project him doing. I do think he's better at guard with Knijeah Harris at center. That sounds odd because if you watch the spring game, Roderick Kearney played center for some reason, and Knijeah Harris played guard for some reason. Florida's been working them at those spots. I don't understand why. It does not make sense to me, but that's what they've been working them at. And I hate it. I will say that. But I think Roderick Kearney is legitimate, like all SEC potential type of guard, especially when you look at Rob Sale and Darnell Stapleton and their resumes as offensive line developers. We could talk about recruiting all we want and how it's been pretty underwhelming to this point. But as offensive line developers, I think that at least Rob Sale, you can't really debate whether or not he's a good offensive line developer. He's proven time and time again that he is. Okay, so I think when you look at Rob Sale, what he brings to this offensive line, fantastic. When you look at Darnell Stapleton's NFL experience and coaching experience so far, although he's relatively new to it, still pretty dang good. And when you look at that as your second option as an offensive line coach, really dang good. So I think Roderick Kearney better suited to either guard spot. I'm not particular there, and Knijeah Harris should be center. But I also do see the value in going, okay, well, guess what? Both of them can play all three spots on the interior. That's kind of cool, right? To have that when we talk about depth, that's kind of cool. Then you look at Caden Jones, who is someone who hasn't really been talked about much as far as this 2023 recruiting class because he was, I believe, the last commit to the class because he committed at the All-American game. And he signed, obviously, but he committed at the All-American game. So I believe he was the last commit to this class. But just incredible size, 6'7.5", 329 is what he's listed at. Just insane size that this coaching staff loves. But I think the bigger selling point is he dominated at the All-American game, like which is the last time that I've seen him do anything on the football field, he dominated. Like that can't be overstated. He destroyed at the All-American game when Samson Okunlola was the big hype tackle, the selling point there along the offensive line because he's pancake honcho, all that stuff. And I do still think he'll be great. I hate that he went to Miami because I do still think he'll be great. But I think Caden Jones kind of stole the show there. I think Caden Jones was, I apologize if you hear my neighbor's dog barking. I think Caden Jones was the guy that really stepped up and really shined at the All-American game. So I'm excited to see what he can become because no one's expecting him to play this year, but we are expecting him to develop this year, get work with this coaching staff, with this training staff, and see what he can become because he's a high ceiling player. Like I think that Caden Jones and Roderick Kearney are both all SEC potential players. I'm not saying that with Knijeah Harris or Bryce Lovett. I love them, but I don't think that they're all SEC caliber players. I think Roderick Kearney and Caden Jones, with the proper development, can become that. I think their physical skill set allots for that. Talking about Bryce Lovett, I think that with Bryce Lovett, he was the lowest ranked player in this class. Yeah, he was the lowest ranked player in this 2023 recruiting class. Knijeah Harris was the second lowest ranked player. But I think that with that obviously lowers expectations. And you kind of accept it as long as their floor is lower, right? Like, I don't need Knijeah Harris or Bryce Lovett to become all SEC players. But I will say that I love their versatility as depth swing players. Like, you have Bryce Lovett, who has experience playing both guard spots and right tackle. Knijeah Harris, who now has experience playing center and guard. And you can now throw them in interchangeably in a pinch if you need that. And so I think adding that depth or bringing that depth and versatility to multiple spots along the offensive line really does help the offensive line depth here, where Florida sorely needs it. And so adding that is just a huge added bonus along this 2023 recruiting class. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. Every day we are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Florida Gators football. For Locked On Gators, I'm Brandon Olson. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with Whole Line Sports at Giants Country NFL 33. And I will see you all tomorrow.